Well, thank you. It's really wonderful to be here from U of T. I've been to a number of these kinds of symposiums over the last, I'd say, 6 years in Ontario as we've been developing our quality assurance process there. I think it's a nice way, segue the consequences part that Trudy talked about into my talk. Because I'm coming from the place of an academic administrator as well as the work that I've done as vice chair on the Quality Council. I didn't start out as any kind of expert in learning outcomes. About 6 years ago, I walked into an acting vice dean job in our Faculty of Arts and Science. It has about 300 or so undergraduate programs and about, 50, 60 graduate programs, and I found out in the first week that not only was the university moving to a new quality assurance process, but the province was. And so I was thrown in without really any background expertise into what the heck is a learning outcome and how the heck am I supposed to use it as an academic administrator. So I've had to deal with a lot of the issues that I think may come up today. Faculty resistance, how do we build sustainable assessment systems? How do we have data that we can share across the institution for program reviews? And so what I'm going to do with my time is talk a little bit about some of my experiences. These are just a few of my learning outcomes for today. I had a whole other list, but I wanted to highlight a few, especially the two that are about resources and money. You know, Trudy talked about consequences, and I'm going to talk a little bit today at some points in my talk about how getting faculty buy-in, the carrot is maybe you'll get some stuff for your program if everything's aligned, if your courses are aligned with your learning outcomes and so on. So what can learning outcomes help you do? Well, these are, I think, things that we know learning outcomes can help us do. They reflect accurately what a student should know. They also help us explain the value of a program to our students, which is really important, which is why they need to be student-centered, to potential employers, to other administrators, to the government, and to the public. And I probably should have put on to parents, especially with all the discussions now about what's the value of a humanities degree. But what I found myself was with this question, is that's great, but how does that help me decide if I'm going to approve this new program at the institution? Or how does this help me decide what's a minor modification and what's a major modification? So what I learned along the way was how learning outcomes can help, or how they could help me make academic decisions about my academic programs. Was in the first instance, I could assess how similar existing programs were, how much a program had changed when a chair or a department was coming forward with a whole bunch of changes, and how distinctive a new program may be from a suite of programs. And I know you can't see this slide, but I kind of did it on purpose so you can't see it. These are the 6 various MBAs and Masters of Financial Risk and other types of things out of our Rotman School of Management at U of T. We have 6 programs that when you first look at their titles, they are seemingly similar. Well, how are we going to decide how are they distinct? How are we going to decide, as Rotman did, our Faculty of Management, they added, one of these is a new program that they added this year. Well, a lot of that was around learning outcomes. It meant existing programs had to have learning outcomes and showing how this is a distinct and new contribution to the suite of programs that this division was offering. One of the questions that often I had to deal with when faculty would come in, and it was similar to a little bit to probably what Trudy has experienced, is a faculty or a chair will come in and say, we want to create a new program, or we want to make some changes to a programs, or maybe students are saying, could you please think about changing your program because we're noticing that employers are asking these types of questions. And often when I had to talk to faculty about programs, I would hear, but we've always taught the program this way, so we're not going to change it. We've always taught it this way. We know what students are supposed to learn, and they'll figure it out by the end. We've always taught it this way. Or we can't agree on what we need, so we've added more requirements to please everyone, which is I'm hearing some laughter, so, which is another familiar theme. And what happens is often, especially when you're transitioning into using learning outcomes, it is about this hodgepodge of, well, we like this course, or we want to do this, or we just hired a bunch of new faculty that are doing this. What learning outcomes can help a program do, and what they can help you in my position as Vice Dean, both at the undergraduate and graduate side, I was having to work with and help approve, move through governance, new programs, academic change, minor modifications, major modifications, as well as the cyclical review of our programs. But learning outcomes help you assess, when you're looking at a new programs, are the required and elective program requirements in place in a way that they can fulfill the learning outcomes in a meaningful way. And so this is an important part of what I found that learning outcomes can help me do. Learning outcomes can also help me, and this became sort of a fundamental piece for me, understand what is the content of a program or a change to a program. I mentioned how many programs we have, about 300 undergraduate and about 50 or so graduate programs. I cannot be an expert in physics, in geography, in Christianity and culture, and all sorts of other programs that we have. I'm a faculty member in sociology, and so I can't learn all of this. But what I found was, through talking with chairs and faculty and getting them to articulate, what is it that you want your students to learn? What kind of student are you trying to create? Trying to avoid the word learning outcome, frankly, as much as possible, until the very end when I pulled out the form and said, and now you're going to translate into this thing we call learning outcomes. But it helped me understand what in general their program was, that here's the part where they're developing critical thinking, here's the part where they're developing quantitative reasoning. I could better work with them in terms of how to put the program together, and also better advocate for them if we really wanted to move forward with a new program. And the second point here is it helped me understand the role of each academic component. Why did they need a lab? Why did they need an internship? Learning outcomes also help you understand what I found I spent a lot of time grappling with. What's a minor and what's a major program change, or is something major actually something new? And this is a big part of both our institutional quality assurance process as well as the quality assurance process in Ontario, because one of the issues is every institution has to report on what were their major modifications that they made. And every once in a while, the Provincial Quality Council may look at it and go, this actually sounds like it was something new. You should have taken it through a completely different type of governance process. So if you're an academic administrator moving into the land of learning outcomes, this will be part of what you're having to grapple with. But again, I think learning outcomes can be your friend. And that's probably one of my key take-home messages. They really are an academic administrator's friend. This is an example of kind of a typical case that I had to deal with. An undergraduate program submitted a form, and they have a series of small curricular changes to the program that, well, we want to switch this out, we want to switch that, we want to reduce the number of requirements in this case. We want to take 3 required courses that overlap and make them into 1. I initially looked at this and said, I think it's kind of minor. This was in my early days when I was figuring out learning outcomes. We got some pushback from one level up that this was actually major. So I ended up spending time talking with the director and a couple of faculty about, can we talk again about what do you want students to learn? What's different about this course compared to these 3 courses? And it turned out, because many of their learning outcomes were around interdisciplinarity and how things connected, that teaching it in 1 course actually helped them achieve their learning outcomes more effectively than teaching it in 3 courses. So we were able then to push back on 1 level above in terms of the approval and have this go through very simply as a minor modification. Another common problem that I've had is a change going to lead to brand new learning outcomes for a program, and then is that minor or major? Do the changes to program requirements and the learning outcomes, do they lead to changes in the qualifications that you need for students coming into the program? Does the student entering a graduate program need to look different? And then do the existing admissions criteria still fit the modified program? And again, this is another example that I had to grapple with. A PhD program in humanities is a one-field program. They don't have any fields. They want to add a new interdisciplinary field to reflect changes in the discipline, as well as some new faculty hires. They want to keep this one sort of, I'd say, their standard disciplinary kind of focus, but have a interdisciplinary one. They didn't have learning outcomes yet. So I didn't go, you have no learning outcomes, we can't do this. It was, I can't assess, you can't assess what this new interdisciplinary field means until we first take a look at and outline what are your learning outcomes in your existing programs. Again, I didn't use learning outcomes right away. And it turned out that this was a program where they needed to do, we needed to do some thinking, adding a new learning outcome, and then it turned out the kind of student that might be attracted to this new field was different than the students that would continue to be attracted to their existing field. And part of the motivation, frankly, for doing this was they were trying to get more students, get more high quality students into their PhD program. So that led to a conversation about learning outcomes, led to a much more detailed, much more rich conversation around what does this mean for students, their preparation coming in, what they need to do throughout the program. And it turned out that this was a major change, but the faculty member and the chair came along the way with me and understood by the end, as he said, I don't necessarily like this, but I understand and I now see the value. It's easier for me to understand the differences between these two fields now that I'm using learning outcomes. Another way, and I would say for me, this is the carrot part of learning outcomes for chairs, directors, and faculty. Is this expensive program component needed? Often I was getting resource requests. We really have to have this thing because every other university has this fancy little lab or this fancy classroom, or we want to put in this really enhanced student experience thing in our program, and we need to hire this and this and this and this. Well, how am I supposed to assess that? This is where both, I'd say, at the institutional level as well as the quality council level, it's around, oops, sorry, didn't mean to move there yet. It's around how do the resource needs align with the program needs? The example here that I have is during my time in arts and science, we developed a new professional master's program in financial insurance with our Department of Statistical Sciences. The initial proposal said, and I'm not making this up, we need a placement because that's what these types of programs have. There has to be an internship. It's a professional master's program. Everybody has one. We have to have one. Because I was a mean administrator, I pushed back on that and said, well, what's the academic rationale for this? What kind of professional are you trying to create by the end of your program? You have to convince me, why is it so important that you need to be able to tell me why students need to learn this? This then opened the door where we had a much more, I think, nuanced academic discussion. It wasn't about resources, it was about academic discussions of what is this program trying to do? What kind of professional are we trying to create? And by the end, we were able to craft, I think, a great new program proposal. I was able to justify to help the program justify the need for additional resources, build it into the budget for this, all of the bells and whistles we needed for the placement positions and the internship components. And again, it was through learning outcomes and through helping a director and an associate director and a bunch of faculty start to think about not just we have to have it because, but what do we want students to learn? Now I'm going to turn a little bit to external reviews. And I'll just ask you if your experience is like mine. When you do external reviews, do your reviewers usually recommend that a program needs more faculty? More administrative or technical staff? And more or better space? This is what I found when I took over the program reviews, that it was like, well, they need more faculty, they need better space, and their secretarial staff, their clerical staff, their administrative staff is overworked, so they need more of that. And that's all fine and good, but this was where, again, learning outcomes helped us create better reviews, helped us get better information out of our reviewers. When reviewers would come back with their first draft of their external review, after, and this would be after I had probably told them about 3 different times throughout the day, probably even more than that, that they were with me, you really need to justify it. You need to use the learning outcomes. If you're going to ask for more resources, please make sure it's clearly aligned with the program and what the learning outcomes are for the program. By doing this, though, over time, we slowly were able to get reviewers and figure out better ways to talk to reviewers to have them justify possible new resources for the program in relation to learning outcomes. So in other words, don't just tell me that they need more faculty because, and they need it in ancient medieval history because every top history department has this kind of person. Tell me why you need it to help fulfill the program learning outcomes. What is this academic content that this faculty member, these new lines are bringing? How do they align with the learning outcomes? Now, of course, at U of T, at my institution, we're not just hiring faculty for their relationship to learning outcomes, but under our quality assurance process and our cyclical review process, it has become an increasingly important part of how we're justifying this. We've also been able to, I've used it to say to reviewers, please don't tell me they need this fancy bell and whistle or a new lab. Talk to me about, for example, physics is doing all this really innovative work in the first year in terms of their practicums and how they transform their labs. And that means we need to figure out what kind of space do they need as an institution? Can we afford this kind of space? And if we can't, what does it mean for this program and what we want this program to achieve? So learning outcomes for me became a way for it to be a partnership with chairs, with directors, where my going into the external reviews, I would say to a chair that this is an opportunity for us, for me to get to know your program, for the dean's office to get to know your program, for us to really understand what your needs are and make sure that in terms of our quality assurance process, we're positioning you, we're partnering with you to help you achieve what you want to achieve. Now, for those of you that are going, but my program doesn't even have learning outcomes yet. When I started in my Vice Dean job in Arts and Science, most of our undergraduate programs did because we had gone through a curriculum renewal and we reapproved where every single, remember those 300 undergraduate programs, had to be reapproved and had to develop learning outcomes. That also was a way for us to winnow out overlapping non-distinct programs. But what we're doing with our graduate programs and what many of the other divisions are doing across the university is as they come up for their cyclical review, they're having to develop their learning outcomes. That meant we've had to build this into our timelines. We've had to have a long lead-in into, your review is coming up in a little more than a year. Your self-study is due in 8 months or a year. You need to start working on these things. And we've also provided support, such as curriculum development funds that are tied to learning outcome development in the Faculty of Arts and Science. For many years, when we were focused on the undergraduate part, we would provide this kind of bottom-up, top-down sort of funds where programs could request to have money for curriculum initiatives, which might help them develop how they were going to fulfill their quantitative reasoning component in their course or social and ethical responsibilities. Or even providing money for a retreat for a program to go and talk about their learning outcomes and develop their learning outcomes together. So my final thoughts here are really around learning outcomes are your friends, linking learning outcomes to resources, whether it's in terms of the approval of a new program, the outcome of a cyclical review. This is frankly how I was able to get some leadership buy-in at the level of chairs and associate chairs of departments, and then they could kick their faculty along the way. It really is about showing them that, similar to Trudy's example, you didn't have them, you didn't get approved, or if if we can work together and if the budget is such that we can all, bring our resources together, maybe you'll get some things from this. And it's through using learning outcomes and for to help us assure that our programs are of high quality. And I'd also add, this is really a big part too of what the Quality Council in Ontario is doing, and what I will assume the Quality Council in Alberta may be doing, is not necessarily looking closely at budgets, but making sure when a proposal comes through or a program review comes through, that it matches the learning outcomes, what they're trying to achieve, match with. They have the right kind of faculty, the right kind of physical resources, the right kind of administrative staff to support that program. And so thank you very much. I think I'll end there.
Thanks, Sandy. Are there any questions of Sandy? Yes.
Are there any best practice guidelines on developing learning outcomes?
On developing. You mean in terms of some of the things Trudy was talking about? Or from me? Well, I'm a sociologist. I learned how to develop learning outcomes by going to a lot of these conferences, frankly, and listening to people like Trudy. I also learned to work really well with we don't right now have a lot of curriculum developers at my institutions, but at other Ontario institutions, they've hired curriculum developers. This is a new sort of career profession that's developing. I also study profession, so I find it fascinating when we have a change in regulation and a new career is developed. But I've learned a lot from talking with curriculum developers. I viewed my job as a vice dean was I'm not the one creating the learning outcomes. I'm making sure programs know where they can go to get the resources, that I'm helping them go in the right direction for it. But I am valuing the advice from other parts of the institution and my colleagues. I learned a lot from faculties of engineering and other places that due to accreditation, they've had to have learning outcomes for a long time. And so there's some tricks you can learn there. And then finally, I used to give presentations at U of T where I always wanted my title to be Templates Are Us. We have a template for everything. We have a template for external reviewers, and it clearly says, do the admissions requirements align with the learning outcomes? We have templates at the institutional level for our new programs, major modifications, and on those are the details around, this is what we want you to do in terms of learning outcomes. We're not an institution that has required everyone to map everything. It's partly U of T, we're big, we're decentralized. You have your cats, there's a whole lot of cats at U of T that we try to herd. We've gone more from, you need to talk about them, you can map them, or you can talk about them in a textual kind of way where you're lining them up. But I can make sure that Peter has some of the links to the templates that we have at U of T. If you just go on the U of T website and you type in UTQAP, UTCAP, University of Toronto Quality Assurance Process, that should get you to our institutional document as well as some of those templates.
Just stay up here if you don't mind.
Jeff.
I found your presentation extremely interesting, especially that academic administrators can have friends and also learning outcomes.
It's a sad and lonely life, no.
I know that's for the afternoon, but you didn't at all mention in bringing in the assessment level. I'm wondering at the University of Toronto, have you been as equally intentional about that element and how far along that is? I realize we're going to talk about this afternoon, but I'm really interested to hear how that fits into the context you provide.
I think that's a great question. My sense is we're really good at creating learning outcomes. We're really good at understanding how we can use them to make decisions. We are, and I would say this across Ontario, when I look at what's happening at Ontario universities, in terms of some of the work I've done with the Quality Council, we're really good in some places, primarily where there are accreditation requirements, engineering, business schools, et cetera, around moving down the road in terms of assessment. But there's a lot more work to do. Some of the work that we've done at U of T for external reviews is we've created what's called the institutional data set, where for every single cyclical review, the Provost Office provides a data set that has a range of data. Some of it aligns with more directly to the quality of the program, but it includes the NSSE, National Survey and Student Engagement results, the Canadian Graduate Student Survey, CGPSS. It includes data around awards for faculty, because we're doing our program reviews for quality at the same time that we're also looking overall at the strength, the research strength of an institution. So we're kind of doing two things at once. But we provide information on incoming averages for undergraduate programs, how many SHRCs, NSERCs, CIHR, doctoral fellowships our graduate students are winning, providing things that are, I'd say, maybe more indirect measures of assessment. For some programs, that is what they start with, and then at least in the Faculty of Arts and Science where I came from, where we have everything from art to physics and biology, there are varying degrees around. Some programs are assessing certain parts of their curriculum really well. I would say this is the nut we really have to crack right now. And in Ontario, at the symposiums that we've been having in the last year or so, a lot of the focus has been on assessment, on making sure you're creating learning outcomes that can actually be assessed, and making sure that you're thinking about how are you going to assess this, as well as, frankly, the record keeping that you have to do for cyclical reviews to ensure programs are doing that assessment along the way. So we're kind of still a bit in the middle. Where you start to get dinged on this is when the Quality Council comes for the audit. I think when they audit a certain number of universities every year, and they pull external reviews, they pull new programs, major mods, minor mods. It was pretty forgiving, I think, in the early years. It's starting to be, what are you doing for assessment? What systems are you in place? For the most part, and here, I'm conscious that the chair of my own quality assurance is in the room, so I'll just give my pitch. It has been formative and not summative, and I think that's been helpful because we're still learning as we go, and I'd say the assessment piece is really, it's the harder piece.
I'm really interested with the implementation there, and my question, when you discussed your 3 courses becoming 1, how did that affect the students with possibly their enrollment and satisfaction with the courses?
That I don't know, because this was a very recent change. So I don't know. It was one that I think in my last year, I was vice dean a year ago, and I moved to a different administrative position. So I don't know, but that's certainly something that when I talked to the program was around, we need then to be watching this, and when you come up for your cyclical review, we need to be looking at this. Did this change make sense?
So just as a follow-up to a couple of the questions that have been asked, and I think we're going to have to end the questions here for now. The committee surveyed quite a bit of literature with respect to learning outcomes and their assessment, and I'd like to remind you that we selected about a half a dozen readings that we thought would be really helpful, and some of them focus on fundamentals of what learning outcomes are. Some of them focus very much on the how to do it and how to overcome barriers, and some of them focus on assessment. And so I'd really encourage you to make use of those resources. And then both of our speakers have indicated they have additional resources they've pointed you to, and we'll make sure we collect those and those become a part of the proceedings from the forum so that you'll have access to those.